All right, buckle up, everyone, because today's deep dive is taking us all the way to India. We're about to unpack a real-life rental agreement. And trust me, you'd be surprised how much we can learn from just a few pages of contract legalese.
You're absolutely right. Contracts are more than just legal documents, you know. They reflect cultural norms, societal values, and so much more. Think of it like this. We're about to decode a cultural puzzle, one clause at a time.
Love that analogy. Okay, so let's set the scene. This lease is from September 30th, 2024, for an apartment in Potheri. It's a town near Chennai in southern India, which I'm told is a real hub for IT and education these days.
Exactly. Pothery is attracting tons of young professionals and students, which is probably why our lease involves three young men renting from a landlady named Miss Lakshmi Priya.
And get this, the lease actually includes the contact information for each tenant's father. It's not something you typically see on a lease here, right?
That's a really interesting detail, and it speaks volumes about family ties in India. In many parts of Indian culture, families play a significant role in young adults' lives, even when it comes to, renting an apartment. It's a safety net for both the landlord and the tenant.
So it's almost like a built-in layer of trust and accountability. Makes sense. Now, what about the apartment itself? Can you paint a picture of where it's located?
Well, the address is VGN Southern Avenue, which sounds like a fairly modern development given Pothery's growth. I wouldn't be surprised if it's in a bustling, up-and-coming area.
Okay, so we've got our players, we've got our setting. Now for the million-dollar question. How much is rent in this neck of the woods?
Hold on to your hats because the rent is shockingly affordable.
Mm.
Ours 14,000 per month, which is roughly 160 US dollars. That even includes maintenance fees.
Wow, you can't beat that. But
Yeah.
there has to be a catch, right? I mean, there always is.
You know it. The security deposit is a hefty ours, 52,000. That's almost 4 months rent. It definitely raises some questions.
Yeah, I was going to say, why so high? Is the landlord just super cautious? Or is that just how things roll in India?
It's definitely on the higher side. Maybe the landlord is concerned about potential damages, especially with three young tenants.
Mm-hmm.
Or it could be a reflection of the rental market in Pothery. Maybe competition for apartments is fierce, giving landlords more leverage.
It's a good point. It seems like every detail in this lease is giving us clues about life in India. Speaking of details, this agreement goes deep. It lists every single fixture and fitting in the apartment, down to the number of light bulbs.
I know, right? It's like they're trying to account for every screw and nail. But there's a method to this madness.
Mm.
This level of detail is all about accountability and avoiding disputes down the line.
So it's not just about being organized, it's about preventing those he said, she said battles later on, right?
Exactly. It's like a super detailed inventory checklist that protects both sides.
Yeah.
It highlights a cultural value that we see a lot in India, a strong emphasis on clarity and avoiding ambiguity. And that extends to the language of the lease itself. Every clause is meticulously worded, leaving no room for misinterpretation.
All right, so they're dotting their I's and crossing their T's. What else jumps out from the sea of legal jargon?
Well, the lease gets pretty specific about who's responsible for what. For example, get this, the tenants are responsible for repainting, repolishing, and basically restoring the entire apartment to its original condition at the end of their lease.
Whoa, hold on. Really? That seems a bit much, especially considering they're initially only renting for 9 months.
It is a relatively short lease term, you're right. But this clause isn't uncommon in India. Landlords often have high expectations for the condition of their property.
Interesting. So it's not just about paying rent, it's about leaving the place looking brand spanking new. What else is in this laundry list of tenant responsibilities?
Here's another one that might surprise you. While the landlord covers property and water taxes, guess who's responsible for most repairs?
Don't tell me. The tenants.
You got it. Even though the landlord owns the property, the tenants are on the hook for handling most of the repairs. It might seem unusual to someone used to renting in other parts of the world, but in India, this division of responsibility isn't that out of the ordinary.
So it's a cultural thing, like part of the unwritten rules of renting in India.
Exactly. It's all part of a different set of expectations and norms. And to be fair, the lease does distinguish between minor and major repairs. Tenants handle everyday things like leaky faucets. But for bigger issues, like burst pipes or electrical problems, the landlord is supposed to step in.
Okay, that makes sense. But what happens if a major repair is needed and the landlord just drags their feet? Are tenants just stuck dealing with it?
That's where the lease gets really interesting. It actually has a clause that protects tenants in this exact situation. If the landlord doesn't address a major repair within 3 days of being notified, The tenants can fix it themselves and deduct the cost from their rent.
Wow, so there's a system of checks and balances built right into the agreement. It seems like they've really thought of everything.
They really have. And this level of detail points to a bigger trend we see in India, a preference for well-defined agreements that try to preempt potential conflicts. It's all about creating a framework where everyone knows their rights and responsibilities.
It's like they're saying, let's get everything out in the open so there are no surprises later on.
Precisely. And that makes a lot of sense in the context of Indian culture, where family reputation and social harmony are highly valued. Having a clear, comprehensive agreement helps maintain those social balances.
You know, it's making me think about my own lease. It's nowhere near this detailed. Maybe I should take some notes.
Huh. Well, every culture has its own approach. But speaking of detailed, there's another clause in this lease that caught my eye. Apparently, after the initial 9 months, the rent goes up by Rs 1,000 per month.
Wait, so it's like a built-in rent hike. They know it's going up from the start.
Exactly. The tenants agree to a minimum 1-year lease. But with that increase factored in, it's a pretty common practice in India for landlords to reevaluate the market after a shorter initial period.
I guess it gives them some flexibility in a rapidly changing market. But wouldn't that make it tough for tenants to budget, knowing their rent will inevitably increase?
You'd think so, wouldn't you? But remember, this rent increase is already agreed upon in the lease, so it's not a surprise negotiation later on. It's all part of that upfront clarity we've been talking about.
Okay, so transparency is key. No hidden fees, no sudden surprises. I like it. But this lease isn't all about numbers and legalese, is it? There are some clauses that really get into the nitty-gritty of everyday life, like the one about subletting.
That's right. The lease explicitly prohibits subletting the apartment. And while subletting is becoming more common in some urban areas, it's still less prevalent in India than in many Western countries.
So why the restriction? Is it about control? Trust? What's the thinking there?
It's definitely about the landlord wanting to maintain control over who lives in their property. Remember, family and reputation play a huge role in Indian society. So landlords are very careful about who they associate with.
It makes sense. They're not just renting out a space. They're essentially welcoming someone into their sphere.
Precisely. And this desire for control extends to another clause that we briefly touched upon earlier, the one about the landlord having the right to enter the property for inspections at reasonable times.
Yeah. That one definitely piqued my curiosity. What exactly constitutes reasonable in this context? Could the landlord just pop in for a cup of chai whenever they feel like it?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The lease doesn't provide a specific definition, leaving it open to interpretation, which is, honestly, a bit unsettling. In practice,
Yeah.
landlords are generally expected to give some notice, but the specific legal requirements can vary from state to state.
So it's a potential gray area, a recipe for conflict if things aren't clearly communicated up front, you know? This deep dive is really making me realize how much we take for granted about renting in our own cultures. I've never thought about these nuances before.
It's fascinating, isn't it? This one lease agreement is like a window into a whole other world of legal and social norms. And while it's giving us a glimpse into common practices in India, it's important to remember that the specific laws and regulations can vary, depending on the state and the specific circumstances.
So we can't necessarily extrapolate everything from this lease to the entire country.
Exactly. India's legal system is incredibly diverse. Think of this deep dive as a starting point, a way to spark curiosity and get you thinking about the cultural layers beneath the surface of everyday life.
I love that. It's like we're peeling back the layers of a cultural onion, and each layer reveals something new and surprising.
What's fascinating to me is how this lease embodies the dynamic between tradition and modernity that we see playing out all across India today.
Now that's interesting. Can you elaborate on that?
Well, on one hand, you see those traditional values we talked about, the emphasis on family, the long-term lease, the careful vetting of tenants. But at the same time, you have these very modern, legally detailed clauses about repairs, rent increases, and landlord access. It's like this document is straddling two worlds.
It's like a cultural hybrid reflecting the changing landscape of Indian society. It's incredible how much we can glean from something as seemingly mundane as a rental agreement.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder about the stories hidden within other contracts, other legal documents.
Yeah.
What other cultural insights are waiting to be
It
uncovered?
really makes you think, doesn't it? This whole experience has me looking at contracts in a whole new light. They're not just about legalities, they're about relationships, expectations, and the way a society functions.
It's so true. And this deep dive into an Indian rental agreement has been a perfect example of that. We've learned about cultural norms, legal approaches, even the delicate balance between tradition and modernity in India, all through the lens of this one document.
You know, it's making me think about my own rental experiences. I've never really considered how much my own culture and legal system shape those agreements. It's like we're all operating within these invisible frameworks that we rarely stop to examine.
It's easy to take those frameworks for granted, isn't it? We sign on the dotted line without realizing the deeper stories those lines tell. And that's the beauty of these deep dives. They push us to question our assumptions and see the world from different perspectives.
This deep dive has definitely broadened my perspective. It's amazing how much we can learn from something as seemingly mundane as a rental agreement.
It really is. And it leaves us with a thought-provoking question for you listening at home. What would your ideal lease agreement look like? What values and priorities would you want to see reflected in such a document? It's something to ponder as we navigate the ever-evolving world of renting and homeownership.
That's a great question to leave our listeners with. It's a reminder that these agreements are not just about legalities, but about human relationships and the spaces we inhabit. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration.